Craig, thank you for joining us.
It's good to be here. This is one of my favorite topics because it's such a threat and an issue to companies.
So to begin, Craig, why don't you start us off by just telling us a bit about the background of developing this survey, what your motivation was, and start us off there.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think as we look at what people are experiencing with fraud, 3 years ago we started the survey. It seemed like there's a lot of individual surveys that cover, a handful of questions or maybe a dozen or so questions about fraud. We saw a pretty significant gap in terms of what are the experiences people are having across a range of fraud activities. What are the practices they're putting in place? What's their spend and what are their plans? And we also wanted to gauge this over time. So there's some good surveys out there, but there was a lot of gaps that we wanted to fill that with because it's so crucial and so important. And so this is our third year of running this survey, and it's been amazing to see the trends, the changes, the response, and sometimes over-optimism as well.
So in terms for this year in particular, could you walk us through maybe just the number of respondents, the key categories, and all that?
Yeah, so our surveys, we have standard surveys and we have premier level surveys. Premier level surveys are really long, and people tell us that you can't run surveys this long, and at which point I say there's 300 to 400 of you who say that's not the case. People want good information. They're willing to spend time, 25 minutes, 30 minutes, 35 minutes, giving a lot of data that can be combined with others in the industry so they can see what goes on. So we have over 300 respondents to this survey, as we have for each of the 3 years. Just in terms of a makeup, we have over 200 breakout questions. Now, don't get too scared by that. The questions are, if you're a banker, you have a different stream of questions. If you're a corporate practitioner, you have others. Some have follow-on questions, et cetera. So nobody's answering 200 questions, but there's a lot of questions. Over 15 industries are represented, including, the financial organizations as well as various types of corporate treasury practitioners. We look at the regions that people cover. 94% of organizations have operations in North America. 52% have operations in Western Europe. Asia Pacific is 49%. Even Central and South America, for our survey population, had 43% had operations there. So this is significant. The Treasury, the cash manager, is the predominant respondent. 26% had that title. 17% were treasurers of organizations. Then we had 15% were ATs. Treasury analysts were also 15%, and about 1 in 25 were CFOs of organizations. So very good representative globally, good mix of respondents across the industry. And so we have 3 years of really good data.
Great. Thank you for giving us that background. So now as we delve into the actual key findings, the meat of the results, the first point that I see listed here is that fraud remains a top corporate focus in 2018. So could you give us a little bit of information about how you came to that conclusion?
Well, we don't necessarily need a survey to show that it's a top concern. I mean, to show that it is one of the very top concerns, you can say the survey points us out, but you can see that in the press, in the media, in talking with treasurers, what is a top concern? You can see that. Our survey showed this as well. So we asked about the threat level, cyber fraud and payment fraud. You can see it significantly increased. 30% of respondents said we feel that threat has significantly increased. 54% felt it had increased. Only 14% had said it stayed the same, and there was a small fraction of people who were unsure. So that is a massive display of increased fraud. And when we look at 3 years, we see more attention to fraud, in terms of defending against it and engaging the rest of the organization to prevent this type of fraud and attack it. So this is in context of that, 84% felt it had increased or significantly increased, that threat level. That's massive.
And I see here that not a single respondent viewed that this year as a decreased threat. So 84% versus 0, that is rather large.
It is, and just, Isaac, you and I have talked about this a lot, but when you think about how people are committing fraud, it's no longer someone going in and trying to steal a check or buy a check from someone. They're using automation, they're using tools, they're dropping thumb drives, they're calling in, they're leveraging technology to be more efficient. And so the attack threat it's very scalable. it's extraordinarily scalable. And it's not, you don't have to hire 10 more people to, grow your attack. You've used technology to do that. That's the scary part. And that's why I think this is going to continue to be a significant threat because of automation on the criminal side.
All right, so we've established that the heightened threat is there. Corporates are feeling more concerned this year than in previous years. What has the response that you've seen? Are they investing significantly in their security infrastructures? What's there?
I think there's a very good story for those that are providing that technology. It's not a great story, but it's a very good story. So when we look at who's spending more, significantly more, we can see spending significantly more. 4% are spending more. And if you just looked at that alone, you might say that's not that much. But this is the third or fourth year of extremely elevated threat level, an elevated and increasing threat level. So that's still 4% are spending significantly more, even though they may have spent significantly last year and the year before. Spending more increased to 22%. So when you combine those two, 26% of organizations plan to spend more or significantly more. That's a pretty significant number in my mind. And the other thing is, who's spending about the same? So if people started spending more, 4 years ago, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, last year, we see that 70% plan to spend the same. So if you've elevated your level of spending for fraud detection, for security, for insurance, this is elevated after a period of time. So I think that's a significant commitment on organizations to protect themselves.
Sure.
So it's a positive thing for that.
And to put that in even more perspective, it looks like only 4% of firms this year spent less than in prior years. So the vast majority either holding their levels of spending or spending more.
Yeah. And while I would have loved to have asked more questions, I think people would kill us if we asked, 300, 400 questions. Why did you spend less? Well, maybe they put in a big payment system, or they put in some anomaly detection software, or they upgraded their technology defenses, or they did additional training. Whatever it was, there's a reason why it came down. It's not because the threat level came down. And I would love to know the exact reason for that, but we didn't ask those questions from the survey. But
Sure.
Those are.
So before we delve in actually to specific areas of investment, any improvements that they've made in their architecture, I wanted to ask, have you seen, I see that the threat level has been elevated, it's increased, they've spent more. How has their perspectives on their own security changed? Are we seeing that they're in a better position to stave off attacks? Do they think that they're more exposed than they have been in previous years? What does that look like?
Well, I think with this ongoing spend that people have had to protect themselves, there has come with it a confidence, maybe more confidence than is warranted, but there's definitely more confidence. And I think, as your point, there's been more spend. We saw, we asked a question, with regard to the threat level associated with cyber fraud and payment fraud, and considering how we're currently positioned, our current posture on attacking this, defending against this. We view our current position as compared to last year as better or worse. So significantly better. 8% felt they were significantly better. So that's probably part of the group that spent more. They're trained better. They have better perimeter, interior defenses to those things. Better was a full 53%, so over half. So if you look at those two things, 61% feel they're better positioned. That's really optimistic. 34% about the same, and 3% said worse. So 3% felt they're in a worse position. Here's one of the things that I would say about that, right? Why is it about the same? Why do 34% feel it's about the same? Why do 53% feel that it's better? If we look at the threat, the attack vectors they're using, the sophistication they're dealing with, the automation that they're bringing to it, the level and frequency of attacks are much greater. They're patient, they're persistent. So it's been a very significant upgrade on the attack front. I think there's been significant improvements in many companies. I don't think that the reality is that 61% are actually better positioned than they were. Some have moved forward, but the attackers have moved up just as well, which is scary to think about. But I think that's a little more realistic given what we've seen.
So we've established that the threat level's been elevated, corporates are spending a lot, And because of that elevated spend, they do think that they're in a better position to combat fraud. So the next section of this survey was looking at the actual security controls that they have in place. Could you give us a little bit of background about what we saw here from the onset? Were their controls actually more sophisticated? Were they in a better position, or was that all fluff?
Well, I think the idea. I just want to declare one point that we don't know. That's something that I said earlier, that we think that it's because of additional spend and putting better defenses, that's why there's more confidence. That's an estimate. That's a guess as to why. We didn't ask why they feel more confident, but I think that's pretty reasonable. I think it'd be hard to prove another reason is more prevalent, because nobody says the threat level's gone down, so it kind of eliminates some of the other options.
Right.
So are they in a better position? There's a number of things people can do to prevent this type of fraud. Payment fraud, business email compromise, man in the middle, imposter fraud, et cetera. So when I think about what people are doing, I don't necessarily see that everything is positive. People are spending more, they're a little more informed, the attack threat's there. So when I think about reconciliation, for example, that's one indicator of how well someone is prepared. And I know you and I have talked about that's after the fact. It's a detective control. So how is that good or effective in preventing fraud? Well, you reconcile, you determine that fraud occurred. Why does that matter? Well, there's one of the 12 security principles is speed matters, and faster reconciliation means you can detect a fraud earlier. Why does that matter? Just like if an alarm goes because someone has broken the window, immediately you have an opportunity to stop them, they run away, you can prevent the problem. The same is true to some extent on payment fraud and other types of issues. If you can detect some type of fraud, someone's gained access to a file, they've changed the payment information, now money has gone out. If you're alerted to that very quickly, you might be able to stop it from leaving the banking system, right? Money moves through the banking system and then it's outside the banking system. Once it's outside the banking system, good luck on finding it. But if you can detect something quickly, you can find a problem.
And you can certainly prevent future circumstances, future attempts from occurring.
Yeah.
We've had stories have surfaced where people haven't reconciled their accounts in months, maybe even years, and once a fraudster hits an account, they get away with it, they realize that it went undetected, then they may target that account several more times over the course of several weeks, several months. And if you're not consistently reconciling your accounts, then you open yourselves up to multiple attacks and significant losses.
I liked your point right in the beginning. It can help you detect further things. You're saying, how does it help you detect or prevent further things? Well, you may have someone has penetrated one of your accounts with a test, ACH debit or something. They're just trying it out to see if the account's active or if there's a problem. If you do daily reconciliation, it identifies and you find here's a penny or a 10-cent difference. Instead of saying, oh, the bank probably made an error and they correct it the next day, because oftentimes they'll do it, they'll send the money back, and then they'll gear up for a larger extraction of funds from your organization. So this idea of we can detect something anomalous or an error means that if we're paying attention, we're doing it on an automated basis every day, we're looking at those items, not assuming it's a bank error, we can say, oh, someone's scoping out our account. Do we have the right defense here? How do we protect against paper item fraud, electronic item fraud, attacks on our accounts? It can give us an early alert and either stop the real attack, or provide us in a position where we can have funds frozen at other accounts. So that's a great point, Isaac.
So I believe you now. I believe the reconciliation capabilities are a great way to at least prevent fraud. Speed matters, as you've said, maybe preventing a fraudulent attempt from actually having the funds clear the bank, and certainly from preventing future attacks. So what are we seeing on the corporate side in terms of their reconciliation capabilities? Are the majority of them reconciling daily, monthly? What's the status?
Well, we capture a lot of data on that, so it's hard to say it in a podcast. I think, going to the site and downloading the information, you can see more granularity across the time horizons and how many accounts they reconcile. I do encourage people to do that. I think a couple items. One is we ask the question, what percentage of your bank accounts are reconciled on a daily basis? You think of many organizations, they're dealing with hundreds or thousands of accounts, that almost necessarily requires that they do it on an automated basis. They get data in, they match these things, differences are identified, people resolve them in a timely manner, meaning the same day, not on a monthly basis, but on a daily basis. This is a key control, right? It'll make the accountants happy, it'll make Treasury happy. You can track and see this stuff. So we looked at what percentage are doing all of their accounts. 16% of firms. That is an increase from last year of 11%. So that's about 5% on the total have increased. If we look at the 90 to 90%, there was a almost equivalent drop there. So anybody who's doing here's a theory. Anybody who was doing 90% or more, some of those completed the process of getting all their accounts on automatic reconciliation. So if you look at the top two, there's been no change in the last year for those 90% up to 100%, but a decent improvement to those that have all of their accounts reconciled daily. That's positive and very helpful for those organizations.
Sure. Okay, so moving on to another component of fraud and security, and this is certainly something that we've touched on in the past, and that's the idea of security training and assigning fraud responsibilities. So sometimes we'll separate the technology component of security from the human element. Looking at this year's survey, we see that fraud management responsibilities have remained unassigned, so a lot of corporations don't formally assign fraud monitoring roles. They don't have a regular reporting cadence to their group. And compared to the banking side, this is definitely an area of weakness, something that has gone unaddressed. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you pointed out a really good point that if you're going to track and monitor fraud, given the level that's happening today, you want to be very rigorous, intentional, and specific about it. It shouldn't be, hey, we're all watching for fraud. Everyone should be aware of fraud and have a certain level of understanding. When we look at how are these responsibilities assigned, you're responsible for any type of spoofing, business email compromise, attacking, whether it's Treasury, accounts payable, payroll. You're responsible for understanding the different attack vectors they're using, the different methodologies they're using, and making sure you have the right defenses. And you over here, you're responsible for any type of system-level fraud, gaining access to the core systems, or attacking the files in transit, or as they sit in areas that people tend not to check. So assigning those responsibilities, we think, is very important. And I think it's instructive to see how much more banks are doing this than corporations. Banks are the target of attack, right? The old Willie Sutton quote, they asked him why he robbed banks, and he said, well, that's where the money is. Well, banks have a lot of money. They have to have better defenses because people are always targeting them because they have tremendous assets, and wouldn't it be great to steal from a bank? So they have upped their game, and they've assigned roles more regularly than corporations have. The highest level of those who have formally assigned roles and have a regular reporting cadence to the group about how they track fraud, keep current on what's going on, understand, issues that have happened, they dissect how that occurred. 69% of banks have that specifically identified. That's 70%, 7 out of 10, whereas only 1 in 4 corporations have specifically assigned those roles in the most formal manner.
It's a very significant gap there for sure.
I think so. I mean, they're gonna. If it wasn't so automated, it may not be as much of a concern because a lot of organizations are smaller. The amounts of their people say they'll avoid us. Well, they don't have to avoid you because they're using automated tools and systematically gaining information. So it's now you're at risk, whereas you were too small to care about. Automation is a pretty efficient way of exfiltrating money.
Okay. Now moving on to my favorite section of this survey, the actual fraud experiences experienced by corporates over the past year. Supposed to begin, you have here, I see fraud experiences on the rise. What have we seen between 2016 and 2018?
Yeah, so in that 3-year period, we asked the general question, what has your experience been over the last year? So we asked different time domains on this survey, which is another reason why it's so long. And so I do want to do a shout out to everybody who answers our surveys. and completes these. Thank you. You provide great data for the industry at large, and I know we do provide more, a significantly larger set of data back to you, to those who have taken a survey. It's good for the industry, and it's good for you. We thank you for taking the time, and it's very, very helpful. So, what's changed over the time? So we asked this 1-year time domain about, have you experienced fraud in the last 12 months? A fairly straight-up question. This would be, business email compromise, check fraud.
Pretty much any type of fraud in aggregate.
Yeah, we didn't specify what type. So when we started this in 2016, 40%, 4 out of 10, had experienced fraud in the last 12 months, so in the prior year. The next year was 52%. That's
Substantial increase, yeah.
It's,
Yes, in 1 year, yeah.
you're over half. I mean, it's like a 25% increase, slightly over 25% increase. Now it's at a pretty elevated level. Well, it went from 52 to 57%. So that's about a 10% increase off of a significant level. 57% have experienced fraud in the last 12 months. So this shows year to year, and I think people are spending more, they're more confident of their defenses, yet they're experiencing fraud more because of the level of sophistication and the type of automation that's being used to handle that. That is a big headline. That means you should continue to spend, time and spend money to make sure your defenses are improving and changing to confront the threat.
Sure, so that covers fraud overall. Now delving into specific types of fraud that corporations have experienced. I know that you guys asked a range of questions in the survey: check forgery, ACH fraud, card fraud. What type of experiences did you see across each of these specific types, and was there anything that stood out to you?
I think, one of the big numbers had to do with, wire fraud. Well, wire fraud, system-oriented fraud, and the numbers aren't as large as some of the others, but when you think about wire fraud and the size of fraud, if you look at the FBI data, oftentimes the loss is in the, it had averaged, the last time I looked at it, and we figured out it was about $130,000 per incident that's reported. That's pretty significant, whereas check fraud is, $1,500 to $1,800 per incident. That's pretty easy. It's like the poor man's fraud system is, check fraud, pretty easy to do, pretty easy to prevent as well. So when I look at system fraud, where there's attempts and no success, and yes, we suffered a loss, we see it at 17% there were attempts and 7% where there were attempts and we suffered a loss. So you think about that, 24% were subjected to this in the past couple of years, very, very specific on there. So this is a challenge. This is system-oriented fraud. This is one of the areas where there's less attention paid and there should be more attention paid. SWIFT is doing a number of great things there with their security program, making sure people are hardening their endpoints around their system so that they're not suffering these losses. The other area that I think is significant is, payment fraud in terms of business email compromise. Sometimes that's called CEO fraud, imposter fraud, different names for it, but it's basically, can I convince you to send money? Can I convince you I'm someone I'm not, that you have to take instructions from and send money? And that is, 63% of firms experienced attempts, and another 11% had suffered a loss, and another 1% had suffered a loss and let at least one person go because of this. This is one of the most significant elements to me, because we have been talking and fighting this type of fraud significantly through all the industry channels, from the AFP, the Association of Financial Professionals, through our webinars, through lots of different industry publications, talking about what's going on, making sure the education's out there. It's, there's information on this, and all of the, webinars, the physical events that occur, the conferences, and we're seeing, basically we're looking at 74, 75% of people have had attempts, sometimes many, many attempts, and 12% have suffered a loss. 12% of the total have suffered a loss. So it's north of 13%, it's maybe 14 or 15% of those who have had attempts have also suffered a loss. This is an increase from prior years, despite all of the talk, all of the media, all of the attention to it. We started talking about and asking about who was let go. We know a number of examples where someone has suffered some type of loss, either through this type of spoofing. And there's lots of examples where companies have lost money. One example of a company if someone attempted a loss, it was very well written. It got blocked at the very last step. Someone asked questions and found out that it wasn't truly authorized. They blocked it, and the CEO said, "Get this fixed. This should never get this far." And the CFO did some things, but not enough. Later on, a more compelling method came in to get money out of the organization, and over $250,000 was sent out. So what happened? The CEO said to the CFO, what? They said, I told you to get this fixed. You didn't get it fixed. This came through. We suffered a significant loss. You have an end date now. You're no longer employed. And this is significant for the career. People want this fixed. We've had enough warning now, and that's why we started tracking how many people have lost jobs.
Been terminated, right? Yeah.
Well, it makes sense, right? It's like if it's the first time and nobody could have predicted it. Well, okay, it's a new method. They're going to get some traction before it becomes standard. Well, this has been out for a while. People need to put the right type of controls, get the right type of mindset in place, put the right systems in place, make sure they're not violated to prevent this. And there are so many examples of people losing significant money. And the level of these, you and I have talked about the level of these hacks and the methods of coming in. It's like, this stuff is compelling. It's the words are written very well in an email. We've seen spoofing come from email, physical letters. We've even seen hacks through PBX systems. So there's a call from the CFO or the CEO. I'm going on a trip. You need to get this done right away. I'm leaving or whatever. And it comes from an internal, not just a spoofed, caller ID, but an internal, CID coming across the phone. And in fact, the CEO or the CFO was leaving or had just left. And so they're able to confirm, the person's leaving. They gave me this one-way instruction. I need this done, blah, blah, blah. I'm sending an email on it. Make sure that gets done really quickly. And it gets done. So they're able to come in and look like, they compromise a channel and they look like a person. They sound like a person. They use the same message. So it's extraordinarily compelling.
Their mimicry is almost flawless, yeah.
It is. They're copying stuff, and sometimes they are copying, you have an earnings report, they're copying, from public information, copying the words they say, putting something together that are in fact their words, audibly. So they're stepping up their game, and we need to make sure our defenses are in concert with that.
BEC fraud aside for a second, one of the things that I found very interesting looking at the total levels of fraud experience is that even we understand that there are some more sophisticated types of fraud coming into play. There's ransomware, there's BEC fraud, there's system level fraud. But if you look at the simplest method of fraud, check forgery, we still see that more firms have experienced this than not. 53% indicated that some attempts, in total, it was actually 64% of firms that had experienced this type. And almost 20%, almost 1 in 5, had experienced a loss. This is thought of to be one of the most simple forms of fraud and also one of the easiest types for defending. And then even across the full spectrum, more people got away with check forgery than with ransomware. Do you see this as almost a disappointment in your eyes, the level of corporate defenses for check fraud, despite years to get ready for this, it's still being successfully perpetrated by criminals?
I think so. I think I find that disappointing. I hate checks. Checks they're here, they're necessary. Not everybody has converted everything to ACH or other electronic methods, so they're there. And it's just it's the equivalent of the smash and grab, hey, I see something on the seat of the car, I just break the window and pull out, the camera or whatever is sitting there. It's very easy to do. Anyone can do it. So it's open to all. And you don't have to have access to systems to do it, right? You just need paper. You can even print it on a check. You don't have to have magnetic ink because the banks will fix that for you, right? So it's pretty easy to get access to checks. So because it's so expanded, there's different types of, criminals, right? They don't have access to sophisticated methods. They get $1,500 here, $800 there, $2,000 here. they're going to continue to try to do that. So the defenses have to be there. You can't just say, hey, we've moved on to the really big payoffs. But you can't leave everything exposed, right? You still have to protect what you're doing.
Right. Okay. And one final point on fraud experience before we move on to key takeaways is that I saw that comparing last year's results to this year's, there was over a 300% rise in ransomware experience in just a single year. That is incredibly significant. I know that last year's results came out right before the WannaCry attacks took place. Do you see ransomware as posing the most significant threat across all types of fraud, or is this just sort of an anomaly, something that will dissipate in the coming months? How do you view ransomware at this time?
Well, I wish it would dissipate in the coming months, and I think people have gotten better about defending against that. So, we've seen ransomware hit. It seems like they've been targeting hospitals, medical centers, small businesses pretty well. I mean, they've hit, the city of Atlanta was hit fairly recently with that, right, where you're encrypting hard drives, network drives, laptops. So, right, it's tripled. And why is it tripled? Well, it's tripled because it's easy to do. It's very easy to do because I can put a thumb drive, and I get someone to click the option that says, oh, yeah, we can have this program make a change, and it encrypts their hard drive or it gets onto the network. You're just convincing people to do that. That's a different level of penetration than I have access to your system and I can live in your system for a while. So it's a lot easier. And when we talk about automation, the interesting thing about ransomware is they're not only using automation, they're using good marketing techniques. So there's, ransomware as a service. You're like, what? What's ransomware as a service? Well, I create a great set of tools for running ransomware to encrypt hard drives, and I make that tool available to other people. And so if they use that tool that encrypts hard drives and they have to, to get a code or a password to break it out, they've got to pay, in Bitcoin or some other method, usually outside of a normal banking system. So if I put that in place, I can get money for it. So if I create a ransomware as a service, I can sell a lot of people that code, and they can create their own marketing language, their own terms. They can stick stuff on thumb drives. Basically you have a whole team that can market this tool, and you get a percentage of it, right? So it's it's an awesome concept of, hey, I'm using technology and the power of marketing and a distributed, almost franchise model to get this to expand. So some people are better at attacking different industries. They might have better language skills, better techniques. So it's expanding that way. So ransomware as a service. They've also, worked on, loading this up with Trojans and worms so that it'll spread on its own. So it's great. I use technology to spread it, lock down hard drives. If you want your hard drive back, you've got to pay to get it out. That doesn't, that gets blocked some places. So now I've distributed my attack methods to, the individual fighters. They can do ransomware as a service, take my code, put whatever information they want, and I get a cut that way too. So that's one of the scary items. So this is just locking down data, but you've got to pay to get it back, or you have to restore it. And it's surprising how oftentimes you can't get all your data back, even if you're backing up systematically. Something failed, something wasn't tracked, and it creates a challenge, particularly for the medical profession. That's why they're targeting that fairly frequently.
And with a 300% rise, certainly something to be on the lookout for in the coming years. Now shifting gears really quick, we've just gone through the main sections of the survey. So we've seen, an escalated threat and increased investment, also a little bit of an increased confidence in practitioners to combat fraud. But at the same time, corporate losses are growing. Fraud experience is as high as it's ever been, and corporates are still experiencing losses. So in terms of the call to action, or an action item for treasurers as seen through this survey, what do you think the most important elements are for practitioners to consider?
I think one, this is not something that is a single event. It is a process, and the threat continues to rise. The defense needs to rise too, right? How people play basketball, soccer, how they skateboard, right? The techniques are very different. You have to stay current with the threat level. That's number one. And saying we're done, we've addressed the threat levels that we know it, and we're feeling pretty good is the wrong way to approach it. We've got to up our game to prevent the defense, and part of our game is staying current with the attack vectors. How can we make things stronger in an efficient way? That's number one. And that encompasses the fact that the threat is changing, that we need to change our technology and our people. The second area that I wanted to touch on has to do with the human element. Everyone seems to understand that, we need to make sure that our firewall is current, that our antivirus is up to date, that we're regularly scanning, we're doing penetration testing, we're doing vulnerability scans. We tend to think of everything as an IT piece. People need to be updated as well. Their software needs to be updated with training, regular training that they're tested on, and to make sure that they're identifying threats, they understand what can occur, how these methods are done, so that they're more skeptical, right? They need to be skeptical, and they need to understand that I'm not going to violate our process because I'm concerned I might lose my job because the CFO, quote, threatened me that this had to be kept secret. I need to get this payment out. I think there's a difference there too. In another survey, we captured information about who's providing training and who's doing testing on that training. When you look at banks, almost all banks do training, almost all banks do testing on that training. So it's north of 90% of banks do testing and training on these various areas. When we look at corporations, despite these threats, they're not upgrading the software of the human mind. Their staff that's involved in Treasury, involved in payments, involved in authorizations. When you look at those that have training and those that are tested on it, it's just over 25%. And if you look at what are they being trained on, not all of them are being trained on all the new type of attack vectors that are used for financial fraud. It's usually, phishing, spear phishing. How do I prevent against that, right? Those are great components. You need to have them. But your level of defenses need to be a little bit better. It can't be, I've got one play I run in a football game. I have to run multiple. Same thing on the defense side. I need to understand all of these different types of attacks, from a human element, from how it looks, from a technology perspective, from the exterior to the interior, to transport, to third-party data, to how we respond and how we can address these type of issues and lock things down. Those are a couple of the key takeaways. Spend money, make sure it's spent right. Understand that this is not a single event. You have to make sure that you're addressing the continued rise and that you upgrade not just technology but people.
Great. All right, well, thank you so much, Craig.